Hey, folks, my friend Gary, he didn't have a great start in life. Gary's parents divorced when he was just 3 years old. And Gary is dyslexic. And back in the 1970s, when Gary was at school, there was little understanding of dyslexia. So Gary left school at 16. He had 1 O-level. That was the equivalent of GCSEs back in the day. Gary leaves school at 16. He's got no qualifications apart from this 1 O-level. So Gary starts working at the local bike shop. Gary works in the bike shop for 7 years until he gets sacked for inappropriate use of the office phone in the bike shop. Gary's been making personal calls on the work line, and he gets sacked age 23. By this stage, he's married, he's got a young son. At this point, my friend Gary takes a massive risk. He takes over a failing toy shop in the high street, and he doesn't know much about selling toys, but it turns out Gary is rather good at running the toy shop, and Gary makes a success of the toy shop. Then one lady comes in to the shop, and she says, I haven't come in to buy anything, she says. I haven't come in to buy anything, she says. I've come to complain. Gary says, complain? What about? About your window. Gary looks in the toy shop window. In the window, Gary's got a witch, a broomstick, some fangs, some fake blood, and various other Halloween paraphernalia. Gary looks at all this and he says, I don't get it. What's wrong with my window? The lady says, you're encouraging children to play with darkness, the lady says. And Gary thinks, oh, grief alive, I've got a right religious nutter here. And so trying not to laugh, Gary says to this woman, look, madam, I don't know how you earn a living, but I earn a living by selling things in my shop. And so I put things in my shop window that people want to buy, and it's Halloween next week, so like every other toy shop in Britain, I've got Halloween stuff in my October window. And the woman says, what's your name? He says, Gary. The woman says, Gary, the Lord says, if you will honor me with your money, I will honor you. And then she walks out. And Gary thinks, oh, she must be one of those fruitcake, born-again Christian types, that you hear about. Anyway, wouldn't you just know it? 2 years later, Gary's wife becomes a Christian. And then 2 years after that, she invites Gary along to a men's breakfast at her church. Gary hears somebody talk about Jesus in a way that Gary can understand. That very day, Gary gives his life to Christ. Now, a few years after that, Gary's driving along, and he's traveling from Oxford back to his shop in Amersham. He's driving along the M40, and he feels that God is speaking to him, and he feels that God is telling him to do something really strange. Meanwhile, while all this is happening, there's another man, different bloke, who's the same age, only lives 10 miles away. This guy feels called by God to give up being an accountant in order to reach teenagers with the good news about Jesus. And this Greek Cypriot youth leader has got a crazy idea. This guy, called Mike, he reckons that God has called him to reach hundreds of teenagers with the gospel so that they can become Christians. And his crazy idea is that he plans to gather hundreds of teenagers in a place called Shepton Mallet in the summer of 1993. And meanwhile, he also wants to launch a church in his hometown at the same time. And Mike's plan is that his summer thing to reach teenagers who wouldn't normally go to church, and his church where he lives, in the town where he lives, to reach teenagers who wouldn't normally go to church, both the summer event and his church are both going to be called the same thing. He's going to call it Soul Survivor. But the thing is, Mike's only got 11 people in his church. And a whole year later, Mike's still only got 21 people in his church. But remember, God has called Mike to reach lost people with the good news about Jesus. So every Friday night, Mike's little church run an outreach to teenagers in their town, but they haven't got any money. And so every time they do the outreach on Friday, they have to hire the sound equipment, And there's this one guy in a church called Dave. Dave's 18. It's Dave's job at the end of the Friday night outreach, pack all the sound equipment down, put it in the back of Dave's car. He drives the car home. He opens up his dad's garage. He backs the car into the garage, closes the garage doors, locks the garage doors, goes upstairs to bed. 8 o'clock Saturday morning, Dave's job, get back in the car, take it back to the sound hire place, deliver it back. That's the hire. One Saturday morning at 10 minutes to 8, Mike gets a phone call, and it's Dave. And Dave's in tears. And Dave says, Mike, I don't know how to tell you this, but last night, we didn't finish the outreach till midnight, and I got home, and I knew that I had to come down at 8 o'clock this morning and take it all back to the shop. And so I'm really sorry, Mike, but I didn't put the car in the garage. I just kind of backed it up against the garage doors. I went up to bed. I've just come down this morning. I'm so sorry. Mike, the car's there, but all the PA equipment, it's been nicked. It's been stolen out of the car. Mike's response to this news is to process the fact that because the car was left in public view, you could see it from the street, Mike knows that insurance will not cover the loss of the sound equipment. Mike already knows the sound equipment is going to cost £3,500 to replace. So Mike says to Dave, Dave, don't tell anyone what you've just told me yet. Just let me live with this news for an hour or so. Let me just get used to what you've just said. Don't tell anyone. Mike puts the phone down, and Mike thinks, that is it. We're finished. We're finished because Mike knows of the 21 people in this church, there are only 4 of them who earn a salary. There is no way that they can raise the £3,500 that they need. Mike says out loud to God, Soul Survivor is finished before it has even started. He says out loud to God, Lord, this is the end. At 11 a.m., 3 hours after that, Mike gets a phone call from someone that he's only met once in his whole life. He hardly knows this bloke. Who is it? It's our friend Gary. Gary, who's become a Christian. Gary, who's been driving on the M40 from Oxford to Amersham. He gets this phone call. Gary says, is that Mike Pilavarchi? Mike says, yeah. He says, well, I don't know why I'm supposed to do this, but I've been driving along the M40, and I feel God's told me to do 3 things. First of all, God told me to get your phone. I've had to ring loads of people to get your number, you know. I've had to ring you. Secondly, God told me that I'm supposed to write a check right now and put it in the post to you immediately for £3,500. And thirdly, God told me to tell you, Mike, that this check comes with a message from God. And the message, Mike, is this: never let money stop you from doing what God has called you to do with young people. Now, that was an inspiration from Mike. £3,500 was exactly the sum that Soul Survivor needed. And that, folks, is how Soul Survivor began. And Mike will tell you that that lesson of the reality of God, that God is real, that inspired Mike in terms of going on an adventure, in terms of trusting God by investing money to reach people who don't know Jesus. Mike began an adventure with God in trusting money. And just a few weeks after this, the first ever Soul Survivor happened. There were 1,800 teenagers who turned up in 1993, and Mike has carried on investing money in a God who he knows has promised to not let him down. And Soul Survivor grew massive, and for many years now, nearly 30,000 teenagers, many of whom have not gone to church, come every single summer to Shepton Mallet and find Jesus. And there are hundreds of other people who become Christians through the church, through Soul Survivor Church. But folks, that is not the end of the story. What about our friend Gary? Gary, who's just given away £3,500. Whatever happened to Gary? 2 years after this happened, Sunday trading comes in. And all the other toy shops start opening on Sundays, 7 days a week. And Gary says, no, I've been a Christian for 3 or 4 years now, and I think I've realized God says in the Bible that 6 days of work, 1 day of rest is a really good principle. And so I believe in a Sabbath rest because God believes in a Sabbath rest. So you know what? None of my shops are going to open on Sundays. But then, of course, what happens next is that all over Britain, all these big shopping centers start opening, and all the shops in all the shopping centers are all opening 7 days a week. And so Gary goes to all the shopping centers and says, "Can I have a unit, please?" And in particular, there's one towards the end he really wants to get into. It's the first Westfield Shepherd's Bush. Gary says to Westfield, "Can I have a unit, please?" And they say, No, of course not. And Gary says, "Why ever not?" The shopping center says, "Well, do the maths. All your competitors are trading 7 days a week. You're only trading 6 days a week. You're shut on Sundays. If we give the unit to you, all these other shops will put you out of business within 6 months. We'll have to find a new tenant for your unit. There's no point giving you the unit. You're only going to be here for 6 months." And Gary remembers the lady. You remember the lady that came into the shop all those years ago? The lady that said, "Gary, if you will honor me with your money, I will honor you." And Gary says to the shopping center, "If you give me this unit, I will sell more toys in 6 days than my competitors can sell in 7. Okay, what happened next? Guess what? Gary Grant has got his shop in Westfield. He's now got 130 toy shops in the UK. They're all called The Entertainer. And today, The Entertainer is the biggest independent toy retailer in Britain. And the Sunday Times newspaper estimates that this year, The Entertainer will make £170 million. And while over the past 20 years, hundreds of other toy shops have gone out of business despite trading 7 days a week, The Entertainer has kept growing despite only trading 6 days a week. And not only does Gary give away much of his own money to God, but The Entertainer is a business that gives away 10% of all its profits to children's charities. The Entertainer has no staff on 0 hours contracts. And get this, The Entertainer is one of only a handful of major retailers in Britain that deliberately prioritizes giving jobs to young people with absolutely no qualifications at all. How about that?